Recently, I found myself in Clearwater, Florida, at a place known as Celebration Station. This is pretty close to where I grew up before moving to Orlando, and I have a lot of memories of coming here as a kid, either just as something to do, or because I was invited to birthday parties. The main building here is essentially just a giant arcade that spans 2 floors, and at the top, there's also a laser tag arena. If you move outside, you'll find attractions like mini golf, bumper boats, and go-karts. And overall, it's a pretty fun little complex that you can spend a fair amount of time in if you're looking for something to do in the area. You might be wondering why I'm mentioning it though, and the reason I was drawn here was because of its animatronics. I remember that the dining room had an animatronic band that, like Chuck E. Cheese, would play songs to entertain kids. I also specifically remember that if you booked a birthday party, Celebration Station would also provide a cake, which would be delivered through a faux mailbox on stage, almost like a magic trick. When I went here recently, I didn't really expect the animatronic band to still be running, and I was right, as the dining room has been refurbished into something much more generic. However, what did catch my eye is that if you look up, some of those figures still actually survived and are sitting above the arcade, which to my delight was great to see, even if they are no longer operating. I went to Celebration Station partially out of curiosity to see if it held up to my nostalgia, but also to see if I could possibly pull a video out of it, even though I didn't have any solid ideas for what to do, regardless of whether the animatronic show would still be running or not. But you know what? If you've seen my video on how much better theme parks and entertainment were in the 90s, you might recall that I briefly covered how Chuck E. Cheese and its competitor, Showbiz Pizza Time, merged in 1985, and how by 1994, all operating locations were switched over to the Chuck E. Cheese branding. Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza was by far the most popular kid-focused restaurant and arcade brand throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and even as a child, I recognized that Celebration Station, which was quite literally across the other side of the highway from the Clearwater Chuck E. Cheese, was very much its own attempt at doing the same thing. Other people have covered the history of Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza pretty thoroughly though, and so having gone to Celebration Station, I thought it would instead be intriguing to take a look at some of these other lesser-known competitors. This video is an interesting one, because the deeper I dug, the weirder things got, and so today, I wanted to take you into the world of strange animatronic arcades, because they really are just fascinatingly bizarre. While older animatronics at many of these places are just inherently kind of creepy, I do think that Celebration Station was relatively normal compared to what I'll be covering later. But I did want to briefly talk about this company, if only because I have those memories of growing up with one of their animatronic shows. The first Celebration Station opened in 1982 in Bettendorf, Iowa, specifically because it was trying to capitalize off of the popularity of Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza. I can't find any photos or video of this first location, but the chain was just a pizza restaurant and arcade, and featured an animatronic band known as WOOF Radio. This show was developed by Creative Presentations Incorporated, and for most of the locations it was installed, it included the same cast of characters. In the middle stage, it featured a band known as the Pantones, and starting from left to right, included a cat pianist named Priscilla Purr, a character on the drum kit known as Peter Big Bear Panda, and finally Doc the Fox on the lead guitar. On the stage to the right was Major Moose, a bass guitarist who also did the weather for the station. Finally, on the stage to the left, it featured Harry Hound, who was the DJ for the radio station, but was also the mascot for Celebration Station itself. I even managed to find a video where he came out as a costumed meetable character when he wasn't performing on stage. It appears that wherever WOOF Radio was installed, the way the characters were dressed and the background on stage could often change, but there was an interesting Western-themed variation that premiered at the location in Merrillville, Indiana in 1989. The Pantones were now located on an upper stage, and Peter Panda was replaced with an orangutan named Buford. And on the bottom stage, between Major Moose and Harry Hound, a new character known as Ellsworth was introduced. Both of these ape-like figures actually came from another Creative Presentations music show known as the Apeologies, with at least one of these premiering publicly at Flamingoland in England. However, Celebration Station evolved and branched out from being a pizza theater imitator, as the same year that the Western version of the show premiered, the same location in Indiana also introduced an outdoor area with go-karts, rides, and mini-golf, distinguishing their brand from other competitors. They also changed up their animatronic shows too, as between 1991 and 1993, they installed a different show as they opened new locations. This one was developed by Sally Darkrides, and I'll just let you read the name on screen, as no matter how I say it, I'm just afraid that it will sound close enough to a slur that the video gets flagged as inappropriate. Featuring an animatronic Dixieland-style band made up of dogs, I was actually surprised to learn that this show is much older than I thought, as it originally was being developed back in the early 1980s. There's a bit of drama with this one, as some of the developers left Sally for a competitor, the Animated Playhouse Corporation, which then opened a pizza arcade known as Captain Andy's Rivertown Restaurant in 1982. Located just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, this restaurant featured an animatronic show known as Captain Andy's Rivertown Review, but because it initially looked like it was plagiarizing concepts being developed by Sally, the show had to creatively distinguish itself, which, judging from surviving footage, actually made it a lot more interesting than Sally's simpler Dixieland dog band. However, the Sally show would premiere with 5 characters at Mark Twain's Riverboat Playhouse in Kendall, Florida in 1982, which was then followed a few months later by a version at Pizza Pizzazz Funtime Food Emporium in Columbus, Ohio. By the time that Sally worked with Celebration Station, the band had been reduced to 3 members, which, from left to right, featured an old Confederate war dog known as Colonel Buford T. Beauregard III, a Louis Armstrong-inspired trumpeter known as Scratchmo, and on the piano is Daniel T. Bones, the leader of the group. When they made their way to Celebration Station, they were also accompanied by another character on a separate stage known as Jethro P. Hogg, a guitarist who would sing a birthday song as a faux mailbox opened and revealed your birthday cake. As I spoke about earlier, this is the version that I remember from the Clearwater location, and it's nice to see the animatronics now preserved, even if they're no longer operating. Moving past 1993 though, all other Celebration Stations would instead open with a reskin of the Dixieland Trio, which was known as the Rockin' Rascals and featured characters from Woof Radio. From left to right, they were Major Moose, Calvin Cat, which I think might be a new character, and finally Priscilla Purr. Strangely enough, this version of the show has the least amount of documentation, which I suspect might be because there just weren't too many new locations opening past this point. If you enjoyed this short look at Celebration Station, I personally wanted to cover it because I have that specific memory of Jethro P. Hogg revealing a birthday cake, and I wanted to learn more about the show. But since we've now wrapped up this segment, let's move on to something that's a lot more interesting. For help with this video, I made a post on my community tab and asked people for their experiences with these kinds of places, and I got a lot of really good responses. For example, many people mentioned Dandy Bear, which opened its first restaurant in 1992 and grew into a small chain that had 3 locations around Miami, Florida. A lot of people expressed love for this chain as they grew up going here, just as I did with Celebration Station, but its animatronic show, known as Dandy Bear's Fun Day Band, is lacking something distinct that I'm really looking to showcase. Examples of something more unique include Pizza Peddler, which literally had an animal-like figure pedal out on a bike to deliver pizza to your table. The original location opened in 1984 in Sioux City, Iowa, but was quickly renamed to Piccadilly Circus, and from there, eventually became known as Gigglebees in 1989. From here, the restaurant franchised out with a few locations throughout the 90s, and while not really that successful, still had that unique element of the figure that delivered pizza to your table, which had a few variations of different characters. I also want to point out that whoever operated the figure could also interact with and speak with diners through a microphone, which in my opinion seemed quite disconcerting. So thank you to Morbid Girls for suggesting this one.
Taken care of.
Trust you. All right, bye.
A few other people mentioned Klondike Kate's, which isn't a traditional pizza arcade, but is instead located in a water park in New York, known as Enchanted Forest Water Safari. What makes the animatronics interesting here is that they are clearly just reskinned Chuck E. Cheese figures known as Rocky and the Ramblin' Rascals. There's not much to say about it, but I thought it was interesting enough to make the video because the reskin somehow makes them creepier than they previously were. Another restaurant mentioned by a fair number of people was Bugaboo Creek Steakhouse, which started in 1992 and was located throughout the eastern United States. The restaurant itself was decorated like a lodge and themed to the Pacific coast of Canada, but a big part of what made it remarkable was that diners were surrounded by animatronics. Most people would remember the mounted animal heads like Moxie the Moose and Bill the Buffalo, both of which would annoy patrons with their running commentary about the food. I also managed to find footage of a talking tree, who seems to take 30 seconds to explain the origin of the maple leaf on the Canadian flag. Unfortunately, Bugaboo Creek Steakhouse is not well documented, despite its last restaurant closing in 2016. But I do think it has a well-deserved place in this video just through how unique it was. Another restaurant that was quite similar was a small chain in New York City, known as the Jekyll and Hyde Club. Very much inspired by Disney's Adventurers Club at Pleasure Island, this restaurant had a horror theme where animatronics would interact with guests through a hidden person who had access to cameras and a microphone. I actually covered the story of this restaurant in a lot more depth in the 90s video, so go check that out if you want to learn more about its fascinating history, but I also thought it was worth a mention here, because how could I not? Returning back to pizza arcades, there was a short-lived chain known as Tex Critter's Pizza Jamboree. Briefly existing from 1982 and up through 1985, this chain had a few locations across the American Southwest and Midwest, but was notable for its animatronic show developed by ABG Technologies. The figures that they developed were far more advanced than Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza, partially because ABG employed former Disney Imagineers. If you've seen my video where I covered the history of the Universal Studio Tram Tour, you might recall the segments on Battlestar Galactica and Castle Dracula, which ABG produced animated figures for. They also developed a lot of the moving figures for Seuss Landing and Tuna Lagoon at Islands of Adventure. So to see some of their early work at Tex Critter's Pizza, you can see the figures are notable for their fluidity and higher degree of movement. Another interesting establishment mentioned by a lot of people was Woody Woodchuck's, which essentially was a Canadian ripoff of Chuck E. Cheese, which opened 2 locations, one in Scarborough in 1995, and the other in Mississauga in 2000. The restaurants featured a stiff and horrifying animatronic band made up of woodchucks, or groundhogs, and you can even meet Woody Woodchuck himself as this terrifying costumes character. Speaking of which, while this video is mostly focused on animatronic bands, the following commercial might just include the scariest character I've ever seen.
Now you can celebrate your birthday with pepperoni and Sylvester Stallion at the Pizza Planet. For $5.50 per person, you'll get pizza, pop, game tokens, and an ice cream sundae. Plus a special birthday show with pepperoni and a visit with Sylvester Stallion and a member of the Buffalo Stallions team. 10 or more in your party, and the birthday person will receive an autographed soccer ball. So have your best birthday ever at the Pizza Planet.
Now, back to our program.
Absolutely terrifying. While there were many Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza ripoffs throughout the 80s and 90s, most of them were just pretty generic, and in my eyes wouldn't make for an interesting video. For this segment, I hopefully highlighted restaurant animatronics that were notable because they were either creepy or at least were unique in some way. But while Chuck E. Cheese continued to dominate the branding for pizza arcades through the late 20th century, it didn't stop licensed characters from trying to compete either. So let's take a look at them next. It appears that sometime in the 80s, Little Caesars Pizza attempted to open a small chain of family fun centers in the Midwest, known as Little Caesars Family Fun Pizzeria. It appeared to have a small playground and some interactive toys, but wasn't much more than this. However, the concept seemed to evolve into a different chain known as Caesarland in the late 90s and early 2000s, becoming more akin to Chuck E. Cheese and featuring climbable play structures and arcades. There is a weird lack of documentation of these restaurants, especially considering that the last one closed in 2011, but there was apparently an animatronic band that featured Caesar himself. He played the harp and was accompanied by what looks like a fox with a tambourine, and a bear playing either the bass or cello. This is apparently lost media, as no video has ever surfaced of this band, but I wouldn't be surprised if it never made a public debut either, as the photo came from a promotional magazine that showcased animatronics from creative presentations. Another notable licensed chain is Bullwinkle's Family Food and Fun, which I actually mentioned briefly in another video from a few years ago. The first location opened in 1982 in Santa Clara, California, and as you entered the restaurant, you would be greeted by employees dressed as Canadian Mounties. In what appears to be a lobby area where patrons ordered food, there was a display called Dudley Do-Right's Lockup, which featured an animatronic Snidely Whiplash that would interact with kids. The restaurant also had food with themed names that referenced either characters or gags from the show, and sitting in the main dining area, known as Bullwinkle's Showroom, guests would experience an animatronic show that depicted these characters. Produced by ABG Technologies, the center stage featured Rocky and Bullwinkle as the hosts, and were joined by Tudor Turtle, Hoppity Hooper, and Underdog. The stage to the right had figures of Tennessee Tuxedo and Chumley, and the stage to the left featured Dudley Do-Right himself. The show consisted of comedic banter between the characters, as well as musical segments, and when they weren't performing, a musical fountain show in front of the stage would entertain diners as well, with one of the songs being Meko's disco version of the Star Wars theme. The restaurant also contained a quieter dining area titled Dudley's Den, as well as an arcade known as Underdog's Mighty Metropolis. The establishment also had a gift shop labeled as Rocky's Trading Post, which brought everything together into a restaurant that honestly seemed a lot more interesting than what Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza could offer. The theming was great, there was plenty of entertainment, and the food was probably decent for the 1980s. As Bullwinkle's Family Food and Fun expanded across the country, they were licensed for a small Northwest chain known as Hewish Family Fun Centers, but were eventually bought out by them and became a part of those larger entertainment complexes. 3 locations still actually survive today, with the only remaining animatronic show being located in Tukwila, Washington. Another similar restaurant chain that also started in 1982 was Gadgets, which opened a few locations in the eastern part of the US. Gadgets was a bit different from other pizza arcades in that it was meant to be a bit more adult. And actually, I wouldn't even call it a pizza arcade because the food was actually much higher in quality. The chain provided expensive entrees, lavish desserts, and a bar themed to a laboratory, which served strong alcoholic drinks and had its own musical animatronic.
Sammy's Whammy, named after that guy over there behind the piano. And believe me, after you've had 1 or 2 of these, it doesn't matter whether he's human or humanoid.
I'm sorry, what? Named Sammy Sands, he was a pianist and singer that would entertain near the bar. And just so you know that he really was for the adults, they stuck an ashtray of cigarettes onto his piano. The The dining rooms were decorated with an eclectic collection of junk on the walls, some of which were actually animatronics. But other than the emphasis on oysters, drinking, and chain smoking, this was actually a family-friendly place because they licensed the Looney Tunes for an animatronic stage show. It was hosted by Bugs Bunny, but also included Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Pepe Le Pew, Yosemite Sam, Sylvester, Sylvester Jr., and of course, Tweety Bird. The show was really interesting because it was actually a little edgy, as in the characters would banter and argue with each other. In one of the show programs, the other characters actually blow up Daffy, which had him being hidden behind a retractable structure and implied that there was an explosion behind it. As it lifts, an alternative Daffy animatronic would be exposed as smoke blew out, and revealed that his beak had been blown off his face. Gadgets, of course, had an arcade as well, but this is certainly one of the weirder attractions in the video, and only lasted with 5 locations through 1984. So, obviously, the theme of this video is animatronics in pizza arcades and restaurants more broadly. But since I had so many suggestions thrown at me, I did learn some interesting things along the way. Something that I discovered through this video was that Sally Dark Rides actually had an animatronic program in the 80s that went beyond just rides and restaurants. For example, one of their promo videos displays Buster Brown and Tige, which were intended to be sold to shoe stores, along with animatronic founding fathers for educational purposes, and branded characters for retail, like with this frightening Piggly Wiggly in a grocery store. However, all these animatronics were all deeply weird and creepy through how primitive they were. So let me introduce you to the Tooth Fairy animatronic for dentist offices.
Hi, I'm the Tooth Fairy. I'd like to see everybody have a pretty smile, wouldn't you?
For real impact, have your dental assistant operate the Tooth Fairy live with a hidden microphone and greet the child by name. With Sally's patented voice-activated mouth movements, the Tooth Fairy's movements are synchronized with the assistant's voice. Not only do children react well to the Tooth Fairy, but also their parents.
Yeah, that's a smile of delight, alright. It's not a restaurant, but I had to include this in the video because I was absolutely flabbergasted by how bone-chilling these figures were. It actually gives me a video idea where I go through the animatronic catalog of animatronic companies, because there's actually a lot of crazy stuff to get into there. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this look at the weirder or more notable side of restaurant animatronics. My main goal with this video was to learn more about the animatronic shows of Celebration Station, and I'm glad that I was able to do that. But it was also an opportunity to learn about other knockoffs of Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza. If you enjoyed this video, you can support me by just simply leaving a like. And as always, if you haven't yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.